As promised in this video, it's going to be up to you to set up an HTTP endpoint for updating a task by its ID, similar to what we've done here for users. That's going to come down below, and I'll start us off with some challenge comments describing what I'd like you to do. So the goal is to allow for task updates. We want people to be able to change the description of a task as what they need to do changes. And obviously, we want them to be able to change that completed value to mark a task as either complete or incomplete. So step 1 is to set up the route handler. Once you have that structure in place, you're going to see if there are any unknown updates like we did up above. For example, if they're trying to update email for a task, we should probably let them know that that's not something they're going to be able to change since the task model doesn't track an email. Next up, you want to attempt to update the task using find by ID and update. You want to handle the case where no task is found with that ID. You want to make sure to handle validation errors, and finally, handle success cases. Last up, test your work. Fire off the given request a few different times with both valid and invalid data, and make sure you get the response back that you are expecting. You can go ahead and knock that out right here, take some time to get that done, pause the video, and when you're done, come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's kick things off by setting up the route itself. We'll be using app.patch once again, and the URL structure will be the same as what we had up above for reading an individual task. We want to update the task by its ID. So for me, that would be /tasks/:ID. Then we set up that async function where we get access to the request and response parameters. Down below, we can focus on what we actually want to do. Now, the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we're not allowing those unknown updates. So like we did up above with users, we want to make sure to add similar code to validate which updates are being performed. Down below, let's go ahead and knock that out. First up, I need to know what's being updated. I'll create the updates array for that. And using object.keys, I will convert request.body from an object to an array of properties. Next up, which properties are you allowed to update? We could always pull open the task model if we've forgotten. We have description and we have completed. So back over in index.js, I'll create a new constant. I'll call this allowed updates. I'll set it equal to an array of strings, the first being description and the second being completed. Excellent. Now, as we add more properties or remove them from a given model, we can adjust the code here as well. The next thing we'll go ahead and do is figure out if this is valid or not. So const is valid operation. We'll go ahead and once again use updates.every to figure that out. For each individual update, is it included in the array? So right here, we will use allowed updates.includes, and we'll check if the individual update is listed inside of there. The last thing we need to do for step number 2 is send back the error if it exists. So right here, if it is not a valid operation, what do we want to do? We want to go ahead and send back that 400. So I'll return. I'll be using response.status to set the 400 status code. And like we did for users, we can always send an error message back. Right here, sending back an error property with the text of invalid updates. Excellent. Now, once we have that in place, we can move on to step number 3 and actually attempt to update things. I will use try catch for that, making sure that we handle those errors correctly while still being able to take advantage of async await. Now right here, what we need to do is create a variable for the task. So const task equals. We'll be using await once again, this time though with task.findById and update as opposed to user.findById and update. Now, once we have that call in place, we have to provide those 3 arguments we had before. The first is the ID of the thing we're trying to update. Request.params.id contains that value for us. It comes from the URL parameter right here. Next up, the updates we're trying to apply, that is request.body. And finally, those two options we had talked about, setting new equal to true and setting run validators equal to true as well. Now, once we have that call in place, we can go ahead and see if we actually found a task to update. If there is no task, we're going to go ahead and send back a 404. So right here, we will use return to stop the function execution. I'll use response.status to set up the 404 and sending nothing back but the status response. Next up, if things went well, we'll just send the task back. Response.send task. Last up, if there was some sort of validation error down below, we want to make sure to send something back for that as well. Right here, response.status setting up a 400 and sending back the error. Excellent. Now that we have this in place, we're going to go ahead and actually test things out. So we've handled those three cases that we listed under attempt to update the task, and the final step is to test our work. So I'll remove the challenge comments and bring the code we just wrote back into view. I'm going to make sure to save the script before heading over to Postman. Now over in Postman, we will set up the new request and then run it a few different ways. Over here, we have our task app collection. I'll go ahead and add a new request to that, and I'll call this update task. Now, as always, the first thing we need to do is click on that and update the method and the URL. In this case, we want to switch over to patch once again, which is the method that we set up to support right here. And then back over in Postman, we can go ahead and configure the URL. Now, to update a task, we do need the ID of a task that's actually in our database. I can always run read tasks to get one. Right here, I'll pull all of the tasks from the database, and I'll just pick the ID for one of them. I'll go ahead and grab this one right here, and we'll try to change it from false over to true. I'll head back over to that request I created and set the URL. That'll be localhost on port 3000 /users, /tasks / the ID that we just copied from the other request. We also need to provide our updates. So over here, we do have our body. We'll switch over to raw, and then we'll switch from text to JSON once again, and we'll go ahead and change that completed value. So right here, I will be setting completed equal to the Boolean true. Now, when I fire this off, I would expect a 200 response, which is exactly what I'm getting. And down below, I can see the task has changed. I went from learn the Mongoose library having the completed value of false to true, and now we could go ahead and update other things if we wanted to. Now, we could also try to update something that doesn't exist, like completed with 2 Ds. Let's say we made a typo. Down below, we can see we do get a bad request, and we are seeing invalid updates showing up. So there we go. We have C, R, and U for the CRUD operations. The last thing we need to be able to do with our HTTP endpoints is D for delete. I want to be able to delete users and delete their tasks. We're going to start that process in the next video with users. So let's go ahead and jump right in.